I've been making candy and caramels my entire adult life. I'm pretty good at it. And I wish I could tell you that I just walked into the kitchen and whipped up this beautiful caramel apple, but that is not what happened. I had to learn a lot of tricks along the way to get this caramel apple to turn out perfectly, and I'm gonna share all of them with you so that you can make beautiful caramel apples at home. Welcome to the Salted Pepper, where we cook for real life using real food and we keep it real simple. Today I'm gonna show you all the tips and tricks that I learned when trying to make caramel apples at home. So I've got it down now where it's working out perfectly. It is pretty easy, but there are some things to know and some things to not do. So I'm gonna share all that with you. The first thing we need to do is prep our apples. This is extremely important. So let me get this out of the way. This is the beautiful one. All right, so you want to start out with any type of apple that you want to use is fine. Traditionally, the Granny Smith apples are used for caramel apples, and that's because they're on the tart side and they pair really nicely with the caramel. But if you don't want to use them, you don't have to. You can use any type of apple that you like. I recommend getting them on the small side. So Granny Smiths can come in really big, big size, and these are on the small side. They are easier to deal with and easier to dip if you ask me. So try to look for Granny Smith or whatever apple you want that are on the smaller side. I'm going to show you another one. Please ignore the colors. I will explain that in a minute. But you can see the difference here. Okay, so I started out with these really big apples and I ended up sizing down to a smaller apple. And oh my gosh, made it a lot easier. All right, so when you're picking out your apples, and I will talk about this color in a minute, when you're picking out your apples, you want to make sure that they are free of blemishes, especially free of cuts. Okay, so if you have a cut like this right here, what can happen? Now this one doesn't look like it's actually penetrated the skin, but sometimes they will. And if that's the case, then you're gonna have juices from your apple leak out and the caramel is gonna start to dissolve there, okay? Because the caramel is not gonna react well with that juice. So you wanna make sure you've got really good intact apples. Okay, now that leads me to the next thing. Apples come usually when you buy them in the grocery store, whether they're organic or not, usually they're covered in a wax, a very thin food grade wax. And we need to remove that in order to have the caramel adhere correctly to the apple. Now, I looked everywhere on the internet, and everybody's saying boil it either in a little bit of vinegar and water or just plain water and boil it for 8 to 10 seconds. So have boiling water and pretty much blanch them, right? And then drop them into cold water. Okay, sounds easy enough. So I did that. Not one person ever said that this is what your apple's gonna look like when you're done. So I went through all the process of, prepping the apples and getting the wax off this way. And they don't turn right away. They turn over time. You think you're doing well, and you turn around and your apple is muted. It is a muted greenish yellow, okay? I've tried, rapidly boiling water. I've tried boiling water and then letting it cool down some and then dipping them. Nothing worked. They all turned out to look like this. Now, I will say that my apples were on the older side. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but really, these were so unattractive. It was horrible. I cried a little bit, really. Okay, next thing that I did not do right was I did not let the caramel cool enough. And that is extremely important. So we're gonna go over that in detail in this video, but you do need a thermometer for this recipe. I do not see any way really to make it successful without a thermometer. And I don't usually say that. You can make the caramel without a thermometer, and I can show you how to do that, but you really need to monitor the temperature of the caramel if you want it to stick to the apple. So let me show you what happens when you don't do that, when you dip them and the caramel is too hot or the apple is not cold enough. So first, let me start off by saying that when these apples were dipped, this is what they looked like, okay? They were beautiful. And I set them down, because you do get some pooling sometimes at the bottom there. And I set them down on the buttered parchment, and as I was dipping another one, and then I just started to see the caramel sort of falling off. It turns out that my caramel was too hot. and my apples were not cold enough. So I fixed that issue. You need to refrigerate your apples, and you need to get your caramel down to the right dipping temperature. The other thing that a couple of people mentioned is, did I have too much butter in the recipe? And I cut the butter in half for another test batch. And honestly, the caramel really didn't taste that good. So I went back up on the butter, and it seems to work just fine. So I think we're safe there. The caramel recipe is a sound one. I think it's all about technique. Like I said, when I first dipped these, they looked like this. The other mistake I made is I left them on the counter. I did not refrigerate them after dipping. And I thought, because I've made a ton of candy and caramel, and I always let it set up on the counter because the humidity in a refrigerator can affect candy, I didn't even think, oh, I should, refrigerate it. But turns out you do need to refrigerate them after you dip them. So we're gonna do that today. All right, well, let's get to prepping our apples. That's the first step that you wanna do even before you start making the caramel, okay? So let me get rid of these, and then we will prep our apples. So this recipe makes about 6 to 8 caramel apples, depending on their size and how many times you dip them. But I only have 2 apples out here right now because I've already prepped the apples that I need for the recipe, and I refrigerated them overnight. So I encourage you to do that. You don't have to go, overnight, but you definitely want to refrigerate them for at least 2 hours. So after the boiling method failed, I looked back on the internet to see what other kind of things I could do to remove the wax, and one of the suggestions was lemon juice and baking soda. So I did that with another test batch, and it seemed to work just fine. Not sure if it totally got rid of all of the wax, but it got rid of enough of it that I didn't have any problems with the caramel sticking. So that's what we're gonna do today, and it's really easy to do. Just cut your lemon in half. Get a little container of baking soda, dip your lemon in, and start scrubbing those apples. And just scrub, scrub. You'll hear it start to squeak, the apple. And just keep doing that until you've scrubbed all the wax off. And then you want to rinse them really well, okay? And that is to get any of that baking soda off. So they kind of will squeak pretty well when they're rinsed and clean and everything. Mine's not squeaking too much because I still got the baking soda on it, but it will. So now I will rinse this really well, and you want to do that for all 6 of your apples. And if they have stems in them, take the stems out now, and also dry them off with a towel, and then put them in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours. But the longer you leave them in, the better. So overnight really works the best. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and rinse these, and then we're gonna get to making the caramel. So you can make the caramel while your apples are in the refrigerator. All right, so there are tons of ways to make caramel, and there's a ton of different recipes, but this combination of ingredients worked the best for me. And I'm using 1 cup of brown sugar. I'm gonna just add that right to the pot. 1 cup of white sugar. Now I did get a suggestion in one of my Facebook groups to use all brown sugar, but I tried that. It worked fine, so you can do that for sure. But I didn't see that much difference in the color of the caramel, and honestly, I like the flavor better when I did the combination. So that's what I'm going with, but you could use all white sugar. Just know that your caramel is gonna be lighter in color, or you can use all brown sugar and it'll be a little darker, or you could use dark brown sugar and then you'd get a really dark colored caramel, okay? All right, the next thing we're gonna add in, which I know people are gonna not like very much, but I tried to make the recipe without it, and I just got a lot of crystallization, and I thought it was going to be a little too difficult for most people to make. So I wanted to make it a little bit easier, and I'm using a Caro Light corn syrup. I don't want you to think that this is the high fructose corn syrup. It's not. There's 0 grams of that in here, okay? So it's not the same thing, and it really makes it easier. You can make it without it, but the caramel is going to be a little more temperamental. And I even started out with just 2 tablespoons. So I really did try to keep everything to the least amount that I possibly could. And I ended up with a 1/2 cup. You might be able to get away with a 1/4 cup, but the 1/2 cup worked the best. So I stayed with that. The next ingredient I'm gonna add in is 1/2 teaspoon of fine grind sea salt. and I'm gonna add 1/2 of a cup of just plain water. A lot of caramel recipes that I do, I don't add the water because actually you boil the water off anyway, so I figure why waste the time with that. But in this recipe, I found that the water really helped just keep everything moving along and not forming crystals and things like that. So definitely put in that 1/2 of a cup of water. The rest of the ingredients, which is cream and butter and vanilla, are not gonna go in right now. We're gonna heat the sugars up. So we're gonna go to sear saute, and high is what we want. And we're just going to let all of this cook and melt and start to boil. And they're gonna get up to 245 degrees. That's the temperature that we want. There is a way to check the temperature of caramel without using a thermometer. So it's not a huge issue if you don't have one for making the caramel. It's more about dipping the apples. So if you don't have a thermometer, grab like a measuring cup or something like this will be perfect, and this is what I'll probably use. Put some ice cubes in it and put cold water in there. You want nice ice cold water. And then when we get closer to the temperature, we'll drip some in, and when it gets to the right stage, it will be firm ball. You'll be able to, you'll see it turn into like a little ball. You'll be able to push it, but it won't just flatten out and fall apart. And it won't be so brittle that it breaks, okay? So it's the middle ground we're going for here with the caramel, because you don't want to bite into your caramel apple and, you know, have it just kind of be brittle. That's not what we're going for. So about 245 to 247 degrees, and that will be the perfect temperature. And I'll show you when we get there. So for right now, what I like to do is just stir a little bit. You don't have to stir constantly or anything like that. It's no problems whatsoever. I just make sure everything's incorporated. And then I leave it alone, and I don't do anything. I don't stir, I don't do anything. Some caramels I stir, you know, my toffee recipe, I stir it constantly. This one, I do not. I just leave it alone. We want it to boil. You're gonna start out with smaller bubbles, and then you'll get into the bigger bubbles as we get closer to the right temperature. Meanwhile, I'm gonna grab some ice water and put it in here so that we're ready. And don't walk away from this, okay? It takes a little while to get going, but once it gets going, it goes fast. So you don't wanna walk away from this. You wanna stay right here, okay? All right, here. So we've got some nice bubbles. They started out small, now they're getting bigger. And I also keep a little thing of water here just to stick my spoon in when I don't need it. It just helps, I think, keep it clean. You can put the spoon back in too if you needed to, but I don't usually stir at this point. All right, let's get a temperature, and we are at about 228, so we've got a little ways to go. 229. We want to get up to at least 245 degrees. All right. Immediately when it gets to that temperature, so between 245, 247, now you're going to put in your butter and stir that around. Keep it on because we're going to still bring it back up to that temperature of at least 245 to 247. And then go ahead and slowly add in your cream. This is a 1/2 of a cup of cream. And it was a 1/4 cup or 4 tablespoons of butter. Put that in. We're not going to put the vanilla in yet because we need it to be a little bit cooler to do that, or you'll just cook off the vanilla taste. All right, now it's looking a whole lot like caramel, isn't it? Oh my goodness gracious. All right, so now we're going to go back up. It doesn't take any time at all for this to go back up to 245. And again, 245, 247 is what I aim for. I don't even stir. After I stir in the cream and the butter, I don't even stir. If you think your caramel is smelling like it's burning a little bit, cut your heat down a step to medium high, or even medium if you want. That's perfectly fine. It'll just take a little bit longer to get up to temp. Now, some people, when they make their caramel, and I've even done this before, they'll put in the cream and the butter and just bring the whole entire thing, the whole entire pot up to the right temperature. But again, I found some separation and some graininess when I did it with this recipe. So I found it to be more consistent when you added in the butter and the cream after you heated up the sugar to that 245 to 247. We are at 241 now. And I literally stand here with a thermometer I don't let it touch the bottom though. It'll be hotter there than it is towards the surface, so I go about halfway down the pot and I just stand here. If you have a candy thermometer, that works great if you can attach it. Personally, I've never found a candy thermometer that worked well for me. They were cumbersome, they got in my way, and I just stand here and hold the instant read. All right, so we're getting up there. I'm gonna go ahead and test the caramel. And that looks like it's gonna be good. So I'm gonna go turn the Ninja Foodi off. All right, that's perfect. So it's pliable, but it holds its shape, okay? So that is the perfect temperature. It got up to 246. So 245 to 247 is what I go for. So I should have my mitts, but I don't have them. So I just grab the pot out, okay? I want it to cool down now. So I'm gonna take my spoon here and stir it around. Be careful, this is hot. I mean, like sugar burns like nothing else I've ever encountered. So be careful, you know, don't splash it around, and you know, even if you have glasses or something, you might wanna put those on as well, just to make sure you're protected. Once it stops boiling is when I put in the 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And now it is the waiting game. Okay, so you want to cool your caramel down until it is about 190 degrees. That is the perfect temperature that I found for dipping apples. And I think it's a pretty standard. I mean, it's not like I made that number up or anything. I mean, that's pretty standard. I just had never heard that before. And that's why I had so much trouble with the caramel staying on my apples. All right, so what I do, now you can put it back in because there won't be any heat source. And then I grab it, grab the pot. This is why I thought the Ninja Foodi was just great for doing this. And I set it on its side. So what that does is allow the caramel to pool in this one area, and it is perfect for twirling the apples and dipping them. It just works so well. It's easier than doing it on the stove for sure. So I was pretty excited about that. The other thing I've tried is to put the caramel into another container, but I found that if I want to take my time to dip the caramel apples, sometimes I'll need to heat the caramel back up. And so just popping the pot back in and using the sear saute to reheat the caramel, because you can do that. You can also make the caramel up ahead of time, and you can use the slow cook function on low, or you could use the warm function if you just need to keep it slightly warm. So definitely you can do this recipe, make it up. When I say ahead of time, I don't mean like days ahead of time. I just mean if you're, you know, making it up and then you want to wait an hour before you dip your apples, that's perfectly fine. All right, so let's take a temperature now, because it should be probably about 220 or so, and it's 224. So we still have a ways to go here. Now it just read 233 in that one spot. So we have a ways to go, and that's fine, no problems. So you could stir it a little bit if you want to speed it up, but I just usually let it do its thing naturally. And now is when I'm going to put my popsicle sticks into the apples. So there are a couple things you can use to pierce the apples with to have a handle. Popsicle sticks work great, so if you can get those. The other thing that worked great are these skewers, especially if your apples are small. You can just insert this end and then cut them off where you want them to be, and they work perfectly. You can insert the other end so you're not wasting it too, but it's a little bit harder because it's blunt. Popsicle sticks, though, go in really easily. All right, so I'm gonna use the popsicle sticks, and I'm just gonna insert them right through the stem here. They're pretty easy to get in, believe it or not. They're pretty easy. All right, so one thing I wanted to say, and I go probably about half to 3/4 of the way down the apple, and I just guesstimate there. If you wanted your apples to be completely covered, because I only dip mine up to about here so that you can see the apple, that's just the way I like to do them. But if you wanted yours completely dipped, after you put your popsicle stick in, you really need to make sure that you dry that off really, really well, because we've just made a cut in the apple, and those juices will seep out and start to mess up your caramel right there. So that's another reason why I go just 3/4 of the way, or leave a little top there. It just makes it easier, and the caramel doesn't come in contact with the juices. All right, so I'm gonna do that for all of these, and then we're gonna get our tray ready, and we're gonna put these back in the refrigerator. You want them to stay in the refrigerator, especially if you're in a warm house, until you are just ready to use them. Then we're going to talk about how to dip them, because that's a whole nother experience I had. It was quite funny, and I will show you some of the products of my attempts. All right, I'm going to pop these back in the refrigerator until we are ready to dip, and I'll talk about those toppings. All right, I'm going to take a temp, see where we are here, and we are at 199, 200, 202. So we still have a little ways to go, okay? One thing I will say with the spoon, once the caramel's done and we're not heating it up, I don't stick it back in the water and then put it in here. You'll dilute your caramel, so you don't want to do that. So I just have it rested here, as well as the thermometer, just so it's there when I want to take a temp, but it's not in any water. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so let's talk about some toppings. Nuts are great, and that's what I'm going to use today, some crushed nuts. Sprinkles are great. I've heard people use Oreo cookies. I tried that. It looked like a hot mess, let me tell you. It did not look right. It did not look good to me, but I bet it would taste good. So you can see that this one is done with nuts, and I go about halfway up. And trust me, I've figured this out the hard way, I think. Make your toppings small. So whatever you're using, crushed nuts, make them finely crushed. The bigger the pieces, the heavier they are, and they're going to drag your caramel down. So let me show you. All right, so this one I dipped, and I thought I was doing a good job, and I thought the caramel was the right temperature. Two things happened with this one. My nuts were pretty heavy, they were too big, and the caramel was a little too hot. And you can see, it looked beautiful when it went on, and then over just a few minutes, you just started to see it kind of ooze down, and that was with them being refrigerated right away. So same thing happened with my sprinkles, which are lighter, which is why I know that it's not totally the weight of the peanuts here. It's a combination of two things there. All right, now another thing I want to mention to you is it's hot in my kitchen right now. I mean, I am hot, so I'm having some issues here. These have been out about an hour, and they're already starting to kind of leak a little bit. So keep them in the refrigerator until you're about to serve them, okay? All right, so we need to have a tray that we're gonna set our dipped apples on. Now, there's a couple different things you can do, but what I like to do is use parchment and butter, okay? I found that this works the easiest, but if you have a Silpat, liner, you could use those as well. I understand they work great, and I do have one, but I'm just old-fashioned with the parchment and the butter. And so I just take a little bit of butter. I've got the paper on there, so I have a handle, and I just spread it around. This is just to keep that caramel from sticking to the paper. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and get the nuts crushed up, but let's take a temperature here first. We're pretty close to where we're going to be ready to dip. So I'm going to get the peanuts done. Now, of course, you don't have to cover them in anything, it's fine. What I found, I tried several different things to decorate the apples. Just a plain plate. Now, this one's a square one, doesn't have to be square, it can be round. And I just put the decoration in a thin layer on the plate. And then I'll show you how to dip them. You would think that if you're gonna dip the bottoms that you would have a bowl. And you could do it that way, except for what I found is when I went in to go into the bowl, I would always hit the side of the apple on the bowl and then mark up the part that was uncovered. And it just didn't work out real well for me. So I found the plates work the best. So I'm gonna take some nuts and go ahead and crush them up. You could do this with a food processor, no problem. I'm just gonna use my handy dandy meat tenderizer and start crushing them up. All right, that looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put these onto a plate here. I don't need to put all of them on a plate, so I'm just gonna take out some. All right, so I'm getting about 193, 194, and that's perfectly fine. In some places it was 188. So we are good to go. Now, do not worry if your caramel cools down too much. You can simply put it on low sear saute and heat it back up. In fact, we might do that during the dipping process if it gets too hard to dip them. All right, I'm gonna grab my apples and we're gonna get to dipping. All right, I like to just gently stir to break up the surface because the surface is not quite as shiny as underneath. So I just give it a little stir, not too much. Oh, this looks so good. All right, take a very cold apple, but it can't be wet. So if it's wet, take a paper towel and dry it off, which this one I see a few little drops of water. So I'm gonna dry this off really well. All right, that looks good. All right, to dip your apples, you're gonna go in 3/4 of the way, unless you wanted them to be fully dipped, that's perfectly fine. But I do, a little more than 3/4 of the way. And it's a twirling motion. So dip them in and then just twirl, twirl, twirl. And I do it 3 times around. And then I pull them up. There's gonna be a ton of the caramel coming off the bottom. Let it drip, okay? This is dip 1. I do a couple dips because I like a thicker layer. You don't have to, but that's how I do it. So once I see it slowing down there, I like to take a stick like this. I go underneath and I twirl and then go up. So what I'm doing is creating a little spot on the bottom so that we don't end up having a big drip down the side or anything like that. I like a nice clean looking apple. And then I hold it up. No joke. I hold it up. I've also tried to dunking them in cold ice water and it worked fine, but it didn't seem to be any better than me just holding it for a minute. So I'm just letting it cool down. Now, one thing, if you don't get all the wax off, like I'm seeing right now that I might not have gotten every bit of it off, you might get a few bubbles. But for the most part, these are pretty shiny and pretty nice looking. I see maybe 2 bubbles here on the back side where maybe I didn't scrub enough. So try to get all that wax off. At least I understand that is what causes the bubbles. I did read that. I don't know that for a fact, though. All right, so once I've dipped this and I've held it for a minute or so, then I go ahead and put it onto the pan and go to the next one. You might see a little bit of it coming off, but if the caramel's the right temperature, it should be okay. All right, now this must be one I did not, this is great. Oh, I'm so happy this happened because it tells me a couple of things, and I've never seen this happen before, but anyway, it's happening now, and I think that's awesome. I may have forgotten to scrub this one at all. I don't know, I hope you can see this, but all along here, there is no caramel adhering. Like, I can see major spots where the caramel is not adhering. And I also see what I think is like wax. So I think I just did not scrub this one well enough, which is great because it means it works if you do it, if you scrub it well enough. That's awesome. Okay, I'm glad that happened. All right, so I'm gonna hold that for a minute and I'm gonna do this with the rest of them. Pop them in the refrigerator for about 5 minutes and then I dip again and that's when I put the nuts on. Or you could even dip 3 times, but refrigerate in between so that you get a nice chill on this caramel before you dip it again. This one's gonna be a disaster, but I'm keeping it. Well, I had another one do the same thing and then it occurred to me, I didn't dry them off. So in the refrigerator, there's humidity. And of course, I told you my kitchen's hot, I brought something cold out into the heat. They have condensation on them. That's the issue, way more than the wax part of it. So, but it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. I'm not worried about it. I don't freak out about these things at all because I'm gonna dip it again and I'm gonna dry these off so that these work. So now you know. This has been a real learning experience for me, let me tell you. All right, so now this one, if that theory is correct, this one will dip fine, and it looks like it is. That was it. How funny of me. And because it's wet, you can see it pooling at the bottom. I might just wash that one off and start that one all over again. So again, and I just twirl and hold it up. All right, so that apple that really looked horrible, I went ahead and I rinsed the caramel off of it with some lukewarm water. So of course that's going to warm up the apple some, but it's gonna be better than what it looked like. So there we go. And it turned out pretty well. So now these go in for 5 minutes, and then I've got the Ninja Foodi set on low sear saute, so it's gonna keep the caramel warm for the 5 minutes. Then we're gonna dip again, get it in some of the peanuts and the sprinkles, and then we are done. Our caramel apples are made. All right, so I had to, warm up the caramel a little bit more. Then I had to let it cool down because I warmed it up too much. So that's why I think having a thermometer is like so super important for this recipe, because it really is about the temperature of the caramel when it goes on the apple. All right, so now we're gonna do dip number 2. And I'm gonna use one that isn't as pretty for a dip. Let's use this one here. For the nuts, because we'll hide some of that stuff, okay? So if you're gonna dip some in nuts or sprinkles or whatever else, pick the ones that didn't turn out perfect, and then you can hide those flaws. All right, so it's the same process again. I do 3, and I try to get it, because of course, now we're getting down to where we don't have as much caramel. So I try to go as close to where I first dipped as possible. But if you don't get it exact, don't worry about it. Sometimes when the caramel hits some of these edges that kind of pulled, sometimes it'll pull it down, and that works out just fine, and sometimes it just stays there. So that's why I say use the ones that didn't go quite as planned for dipping. All right, so now we've got a beautiful covering on our caramel apple, and I'm gonna go ahead and put it in these nuts, and I just tap it. Tap it. Move around the plate and tap. And then tap once on the bottom. Then if you see any places where you need to get it, just tap it again until it's covered the way you like it. And then I usually hold it up for a minute. Again, I don't like to see them pull down, so I want it to set up. I need to invent something that you could stick it in right now, and it would hold it up like that. But I didn't take the time to do that. It wouldn't be too hard, I don't think. Anyway, so I'm gonna hold it up for a minute, then we're gonna get the other ones dipped, put them in some sprinkles, put one in sprinkles, and then the rest of them are just gonna stay plain. Once it's covered, tap all around the plate here. And then I'll hold it up a little bit. The other thing I want to note is don't try to make candy on a really humid day. And I should have turned our heat off because it's a little hot in here. So that's why I'm having a little bit of trouble. All right, so with any leftover caramel that you have, don't get rid of it. Warm it up again until it's a nice pourable consistency. So I either use medium or low heat. When you can stir it around and it's a nice liquid consistency, warmer, put it into a small dish that has some parchment paper that is buttered. And use the size that will work for the amount that you have left. You know, keep in mind, the bigger the container, the less deep the caramel will be. So you're gonna end up with really something very thin, which is fine. And I'm gonna also show you what else I did with some of the leftover caramel and show you the difference between the two. So, okay, so once I get this in, I just sort of spread it out a little bit. I mean, this is gonna be thin. There's not a whole lot left here. But it's really great after it sets up, and I just leave it right on the counter. I don't even refrigerate this. Once it sets up, I pull the parchment out, peel that away, and I cut it into little pieces. Then you could either cut them into squares and dip them, or you can just wrap them in a little bit of parchment or wax paper if you prefer. Let me get something I can get the rest of this off with. And then there's another option. You could add a little more butter, so we want to change the texture a little bit. You can add a little bit more butter, like maybe 2 tablespoons of butter to the warm caramel, mix in some nuts, pour it into a container, and you're gonna end up with a different kind of candy. And I'm gonna show you that because I have both of these kinds of candies right back behind me. All right, so this is the caramel that I didn't do anything to, but just warm up, same as I did right here. So you can see now it is in a complete sheet of caramel. And this was buttered, but there, it didn't stick too bad. So you can just take it off. So what I do is take a nice clean pair of kitchen shears, or you could use a sharp knife, and I just cut it a little bit into pieces. And it is absolutely delicious. Oh my goodness. That's been in the refrigerator. If it's not in the refrigerator, it's gonna be chewy and softer, but in the refrigerator, it gets a little bit harder. Oh, it is so, so good. Now, this one I added a little bit more butter and peanuts to it. Totally different texture. So this one just breaks. It's kind of reminds me of fudge a little bit. Oh, it reminds me of fudge a lot, and it's really good. Wow. Delicious. So there are some choices what you can do with leftover caramel, because you're inevitably going to have a little bit left over. Now, the easiest way to eat a candy apple is to cut it, and that's what I'm going to do. So just going to cut straight down here. Now, these have only been in the refrigerator a few minutes. Oh my gosh, that looks so good. So the caramel's a little bit thicker down at the bottom, but it's a good depth all the way around. So I like that. You're gonna get a good caramel flavor. It's tacky to the touch because we didn't go a high enough heat. We wanted to keep the caramel soft. So it's not a hard set, it's a soft set. And let me go ahead and take a bite here. Ah. Oh my goodness. Wow. That is amazing. This caramel is so delicious. Oh my gosh. Even if you don't want to dip apples, do the same thing and throw it into a dish and serve it up as caramel. Oh my gosh, it's so good. You could also add some cream to it, make it a little bit more like a caramel dip if you wanted to do that. That would be perfectly fine. Oh, this is absolutely delicious. All right, guys. So, I hope I help by making all these mistakes. I hope that I help you make the perfect caramel apples in your own home.